All right, this is Kinesiology 234. This presentation is just a quick introduction to fascia lines, and then also just a prep for the next video, which is in regards to compensation patterns in the body that are seen usually from some type of injury. So we first look at the human body, right? We know the human body is a really cool piece of machinery, if you will, that has a number of different interconnected systems that all work together to make movement happen and to some degree make life happen. If we look at it and we come down to the component of muscle, connective tissue, and bone, and we look at this whole process, we can kind of boil it out to a few things. And Thomas Myers wrote a book called Anatomy Trains, and in it he really kind of localizes this and talks about how the body is held together by tension and compression. Compression being offered by the consistent force of gravity and the inconsistent positioning of our body, whether it's upright, seated, horizontal, meaning supine or pronated. And the position of the human body matters because gravity always wants to pull the human body down towards the ground or pull everything towards the surface of the earth. But the big thing is the tension component is provided by the connective tissue and the muscles. And even at rest, the muscles will provide a certain amount of tension within the actual system itself. Now the fascia lines, he breaks out 12 of them. And in the book, they do a really good job of describing the fascia lines all the way from one end of the body to the other. And as you'll see, it's pretty cool how he does it. You don't have to worry about remembering these for the course. I'm more interested in you just get a basic understanding of the 12 lines in the human body. And you're going to have antagonistic and agonistic muscle groups, right? They're going to have these groups of muscles that all work together, or they're going to work antagonistically. And it's kind of important to realize this where you look at, you have front line, back line, you have two sides to the lateral line. The arms, there's four because you have two arms and you have a posterior and anterior component, right? And if we take this over to this next slide, we have 12 fascia lines in the body. And you can see these two that are set side by side. And when you look at these two side by side, very sagittal plane, right? Very straight up and down in terms of the back line right here, going straight from splenius capitis all the way down to the plantar fascia. Whereas this, if you want to look up Juan Carlos Santana, he's not the musical artist, but the personal trainer. And Juan Carlos Santana spoke often and wrote great articles about the Serape effect, about the musculature around the human body that wraps from one hip around the backside of the body and around to the other hip. And that helps in any movement that's in a rotational or cross-plane movement. And you have to look at it and go, okay, fascia provides the tension that holds the body together. And fascia is comprised of muscle, the connective tissue, and the connective tissue that goes through the muscle. And then the other part of it is, fascia is used to help redistribute stress on the entire system. If we hand a dumbbell to this individual in their left hand over here, that's going to place stress on the system. Well, that stress gets redistributed across the entire human form and across different fascial lines. And I often talk about it in terms of the kinetic chain, and you'll see it described a little bit differently here in a second, but it ends up being this functional contractile line. And so I said it 1,000 times, you have the muscles you're trying to work, and then you have the other muscles that all have to work to help make that primary movement pattern happen. So in this model, when you evaluate what looks to be like a structure of just sticks and connective tissue, what you're looking at is the green is or are the bones in the body, and the red is the connective tissue and muscles, or the fascia. And in this model, no green touches another green. Much like in the human body, no bone touches another bone. You have joints that are comprised of 2 or 3 different bones, but it's not as though you have 2 bones that actually touch one another. And so to that end, you look at this and you go, okay, it's the tension provided by the red that holds everything together. Now, more importantly, when you look at this, if you push in one area of the model that's here to the right, it's going to offload into another area. So that stress that's applied in one area gets represented or redistributed to another area. And you'll see that in a video here in a second. So if you can look at this and you go, okay, this is the functional line for the back, runs from down here by the tibia, right? The lateral aspect of a tibia, up through the glute, glute across the lats, into the humerus. And so if you look at this, you go, all right, if there is a movement pattern that you're looking at here, glutes are generally squats, lats are lat pull down or pull ups, wide grip chin, etc. But you rarely look at it in terms of an entire continuous movement pattern across those different muscle groups. So you look at this functional back line or functional line of the back, and you start to evaluate it more as a movement pattern as opposed to a lat pull down and a squat, right? Or an abduction movement. You start to look at this and go, okay, it's an entire body movement pattern. And where this becomes important, as we'll talk about this here in a second, is it becomes important in terms of if there's dysfunction anywhere in here. So if there's dysfunction anywhere in this process from maybe the left side of the lats down to the right hip or down to the right knee, that can resonate somewhere else up in the system. And so you look at it and you go, okay, perhaps there is some type of issue with glute or some type of issue in the hip or the knee, and that's causing other functional issues in the system of the body. And I urge you to evaluate this with an open mind, but not look at everything like a nail and you have a hammer, because it's really easy to look at this and go, okay, somebody has a shoulder issue and we're just going to go ahead and rub the heck out of IT band or rub the heck out of glute with a foam roller, and that should take care of the problem in the shoulder. Not necessarily if it's like a slap tear or a rotator cuff tear or some kind of issue in that regard. So don't view this in terms of absolutes, but realize that you look for dysfunction in the system to help you pick out what might be going on. All right. So if we look at these two, excuse me, side by side, you can see on the left-hand side versus the right, you have a superficial back line, and you know this is a functional back line. Then you can see how one is definitely more sagittal plane. We saw him on the first slide or second slide. This one we saw on the previous slide. When you look at this, one overlaps the other one. So you can almost look at this in terms of how one set of muscles overlays the other set of muscles, and how when you actually have movement, you have an integrated movement pattern between one fascia line and the other fascia line. And the function changes for each one. Definitely more sagittal. This one's definitely more multiplane, right? And Myers will talk in terms of having a functional contractile path across the entire fascia, a functional path going all the way from splenius capitis up top all the way down to the plantar fascia down below. And so it takes a little bit of like kind of wrapping yourself around this concept to get it, but once you do, it's a very powerful tool. Anatomy Trains, this is the book. This is the front cover of it. This is a link out to their website, so you'll be able to source that. Now when you get here, these are two videos. One of which on the right is a gentleman who is explaining the process of how you have loading across the system, and the other one is the gentleman, Tom Myers, that I just mentioned. If I go ahead and pause this for 1 second, I take us out to one of those videos. Okay, so this gentleman is named Anthony Davis, and he's some kind of movement practitioner, and he definitely has like a spiritual aspect to him, but he definitely has some good stuff in this video. And he's talking about tensegrity, and that's exactly the concept that Thomas Myers talks about in his book. If you notice, here's an example of that model, except a more complex version. You can go online and find different ones for like the hips, for the knees, for the entire back, and find different models that you can look up for tensegrity. Now, I'm going to play this out, and I'm going to talk over him while he's going here. And as he's talking, he's going over, he's going to talk about how when you have the human form, many times we focus so much on a singular muscle group that we lose sight of the entire system, and how movement on one side of this model can affect the other side of the model. It's analogous to where movement on one side of the body can have an effect on the opposite side of the body. So I'm going to talk over this guy while he's talking.
Landmarks on the body, greater throat cancer.
And what I like about this is, how he's elaborating in terms of how we like exclude the rest of the body. And I definitely agree with that 100%. So I'm going to pick this up here, and he reinforces the whole tension concept that we talked about earlier. So when he picks this up, he's going to talk about how the human body, without that tension, actually becomes nothing but a bag of bones on the floor. If I take this out a little bit further, when he picks this up, I want you to pay attention to when he picks this up and he applies force here and applies force here, and he picks it up off the ground, no longer do you have the mass of the object as affecting the weight because of gravity. It's being affected by the force applied by his hands. Further, when you look at the third force involved, if you want to think of it like this, the amount of force creates a little bit of acceleration. So when he pushes more with his right hand, it transfers force through the model at a greater velocity than it will with the other hand. Let's go ahead and play this out. And you can see how he's moving this thing around. It's causing the model to actually change shape and redistribute. So as he applies force with his right hand or left hand, you can see how it affects it elsewhere. Now when he puts it down on the ground, I don't know if you caught that, under its own weight, it kind of redistributed, so the tension parameters were changed. I'm going to replay that. The tension and the loading was changed because it came down to, or he put it down on the floor, and its own weight caused it to redistribute. So watch, when he puts it down, whoosh, it kind of smushes a little bit, but it redistributes a load across the system. And notice how he pushes in one area and it redistributes to the other area. So you can think of this in terms of it's the bones and the connective tissue in the muscle. And even though you have an isolated movement over on one side, it's affecting the rest of the system. Believe me, you'll get into this and you'll fall down a rabbit hole with this stuff, but it's actually really good stuff to follow along with. And I urge you to take a look at that and also take a look at the video by Tom Myers as well. So going into this, I mentioned it earlier, if you have a functional contractile pattern and somebody has some type of injury or activity of daily living that causes an overuse injury, it's going to affect that movement pattern and the contractile pattern. So here's a wonderful example. Somebody is at their desk, they sit there all day, they're working on a mouse or working on a computer. That's going to change the structure of their body over time, and you end up having a case where you have to work with that person to basically reprogram how to be in the right place. Conversely, if you have somebody who perhaps had a trip and fall, a car injury or car accident or some other injury, that's an acute injury. But what happens so often is somebody will have an acute injury, a trip and fall, they break their arm or a car accident, and it manifests itself into a chronic condition because they end up having this acute injury, and as a result of the injury, they have a compensation pattern that causes a chronic pain down the road. So as a practitioner, what you have to be aware of and talk with your clients about is, hey, did you have any other injuries or anything I need to know about? And they might not tell you in session 1 or session 2 because they don't think it's relevant. But you get into like session 3 or 4, and all of a sudden they say, well, there was this car accident, or when I was in a softball league, I twisted my ankle on my right side, and you find that they have difficulty or an issue with their left knee. Very common to have that, where they end up having a compensation pattern on one side of their body because of an injury on the other side of the body. So don't stop questioning your clients or asking them questions about injuries or problems they may have had, because they might have had something that happened 10 years ago, and they have 10 years of history that has manifested itself into a chronic pain that they can't explain other than a car accident that happened maybe 10 years ago. So work with your clients, talk with them further, find out more about maybe some acute injuries they had back in their earlier history that have manifested into other issues they might have now. All right, guys, with that, I'm signing off. Hey, have a good one.